Alrighty, folks. So today we are going to talk about 5 ways that Democrats are attempting to undermine constitutional institutions, American institutions.
We're going to have to blow up the entire system.
Joe Biden should not concede under any circumstances.
The moment has come for our nation to deal with systemic racism.
I think that we take back the House, we take back the Senate, we take back the presidency, and we pack the Supreme Court of the United States of America.
Before we get to that, we have to explain why America's institutions matter. So the Constitution of the United States was designed for a very specific purpose. It was designed in order to effectuate the goals of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was rooted in a particular philosophy. That philosophy can be summed up as God-given negative rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property. These are termed negative rights because, of course, I'm not guaranteed anything from anybody else. Basically, you're supposed to leave me alone because I have a right to life. You're supposed to leave my property alone because I have a right to my property. And you're supposed to leave my liberty alone because I have a right to my liberty. These are rights that pre-exist government. They accrue to you as an individual. They adhere to you as an individual prior to government. It's not that government gives you these rights. Government is instituted in order to protect those rights. So the Constitution was created in order to create a government that was powerful enough to protect your individual rights, but not powerful enough to invade those rights. This meant that the founders were concerned about a number of things. They were concerned about ambitious people who were going to take power and invade your rights. They were also concerned about what they called the tyranny of the mob. They were concerned about a sheer majority, 51% of any population, deciding to invade the rights of the other 49% on their own behalf. And so they created a constitution. The Constitution was replete with a bunch of structures that were designed to prevent majoritarian tyranny, invasion of rights, but allow the government to act when it needed to in order to protect those rights in the first place. In particular, the Constitution puts in place 3 separate systems. 1, checks and balances. These checks and balances are between the various branches, between the legislative branch and the executive branch. The legislature does the funding. The executive can veto bills from the legislature. Between the judiciary and both. The judiciary is supposed to review laws to determine whether they comply with the Constitution of the United States, but the judiciary, as Alexander Hamilton explicitly says, was not designed to be self-enforcing. The executive branch would have to move with the judiciary to enforce its judgments. The legislature could change the constitution of the judiciary. All of these branches were supposed to check one another. There were supposed to be checks and balances within the legislative branch, which was supposed to be the most powerful branch of government itself. The Congress of the United States is comprised of 2 bodies. It has the House of Representatives, which is elected based on population, and it has the Senate, which is elected based on state. So 2 senators for each state. All of these checks and balances were geared toward requiring essentially a broad spectrum of majoritarianism in order to achieve anything. All of this gridlock was designed to prevent the government from acting too fast or too harshly. Second, the Constitution puts in place federalism. The idea here is that most power actually devolves to the states. There are very few powers that the federal government has. And if in doubt, power is supposed to devolve to the states. The federal government is designed to effectuate your rights, to protect your life, liberty, and property. But when it comes to normal criminal law, this devolves to the states. When it comes to a local welfare program, that is a question for the states. Federalism was designed with the idea that local government governs best because you are closest to it. That doesn't mean local government can do anything or everything. It does mean that local government subsidiarity should be the first priority. Finally, the Constitution overall is very focused on enumerated powers. In other words, the government is only given powers that are listed. Okay, it's not that the government can do anything and then we make exceptions. It's that the government can only do these very, very specific things. And again, all of this was designed, these 3 things, checks and balances, federalism, enumerated powers, all of this was designed to effectuate the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence. What we have seen over the course of the last century and a half is an attempt to undermine exactly that philosophy, undermine the philosophy of the Declaration, and then undermine the institutions of the Constitution itself. So, when it comes to the philosophy of the Declaration, there are basically 2 rationales for undermining the philosophy of the Declaration. One is the idea that America is classist, that the philosophy of the Declaration was not designed based on high-minded principles of freedom and liberty pre-existing government, that instead it was based on enshrining hierarchies of power, that the classical liberalism of the founders was not designed to preserve your individual rights, it was designed to keep the rich rich. This was the idea of historian Charles Beard. It was imbibed by people like Howard Zinn. It was kind of popular for Marxists and people who were progressive in the early 20th century. Then there's a second form of this, which is now embraced by the 1619 Project and Ibram X. Kendi, and that is that all of the institutions of the United States are inherently racist, that the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence is in fact a lie. It was a lie designed to protect white supremacy. The progressive movement overall started to popularize the idea that the philosophy of the founders was wrong, that rights didn't pre-exist government, that indeed rights came from the government, so did entitlements, and government ought to be given ultimate power to shape the world and create utopia. Woodrow Wilson was a great expositor of this point of view. He said that the philosophy of the founders was not meant to, quote, dictate the aims and objects of any generation but their own. In other words, the Declaration of Independence was irrelevant for people living in the 20th century. FDR explicitly rejected the sufficiency of founding philosophy. He said that negative rights, like rights to life, liberty, and property, were, quote, inadequate to assure us equality in the pursuit of happiness. In other words, government had to give us stuff, otherwise we would never be able to have life, liberty, or property. So this shifted the focus of rights from the negative, meaning stuff that you have that government has to protect, to stuff that the government has that it can give you. Notorious RBG, right, was a devotee of the idea that the Declaration of Independence, that its philosophy was wrong. I mean, she said in 2012 that if she were going to create a new Egyptian constitution, she wouldn't base it on our constitution, but on the Constitution of South Africa. She called that, quote, a deliberate attempt to have a fundamental instrument of government that embraced basic human rights. This would include positive rights, so-called positive rights, like the right to housing, healthcare, food, social security, entitlements, in other words. So in order to attack that philosophy, you have to attack the institutions. See, the Constitution was created in order to protect the core Declaration of Independence philosophy. It's what Abraham Lincoln called the frame of silver around the apple of gold. The Constitution is the institutional gridwork that is created in order to protect founding philosophy. Well, if you disagree with founding philosophy, you would want to dismantle the Constitution. And this is precisely what Democrats are doing and have done historically. The Constitution is a barrier to this new perception of what liberty constitutes. And again, this is why Democrats have historically sought to undermine the constitutional institutions in a variety of ways. So here are 5 ways that Democrats are seeking to undermine America's institutions. First, they've attempted to end enumerated powers. This has been a long-time goal of the Democratic Party, going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson, but certainly through the FDR administration. The basic idea here is that enumerated powers are not enough, because you see, the government has to be able to do what the government wants to do. This is why, for example, FDR pushed forward laws under the guise of the so-called necessary and proper clause. There's a clause in the Constitution that lists enumerated powers, and then it says, and the government can do anything that is necessary and proper to the effectuation of those powers. So, for example, if the government has the power to create a post office, then they also have the ability to build the actual building of the post office. That's the necessary and proper clause. This has been broadly construed. It's now called the elastic clause because it's like a stretchy pair of underwear that have stretched too far. The necessary and proper clause has basically allowed the federal government to do anything and everything, including how much water is used in the flushing of your toilets. The very famous case called Wickard versus Filburn under the FDR administration suggested that the necessary and proper clause essentially allowed the federal government to prevent you from growing wheat in your own backyard for your own use because it might affect interstate commerce. They combined the necessary and proper clause with the commerce clause in order to basically say the federal government can do anything that it wants. That is why now people tend to perceive the role of the federal government as precisely the reverse of what it once was. Originally, there were a bunch of things the federal government could do. You could look them up, right? There's a list. Now it's the federal government can do anything except for the stuff in the Bill of Rights, which is precisely the reverse of what the Bill of Rights was originally meant to do. Okay, second, Democrats have sought to split apart the checks and balances by basically negating the legislature. They've decided to get rid of Congress, effectively speaking. This is why Congress seems like it doesn't do anything. Congress passes these giant omnibus packages, and then they kick it over to the executive branch, and most of the rulemaking gets done at the executive level. This is why we now have millions of federal employees. It's why we now have legislative agencies that exist inside the executive branch. The EPA makes its rules. Congress doesn't make the rules. The EPA makes the rules. The FDA makes its own rules. The CDC makes its own rules. These are lawmaking bodies that are called executive agencies. Why did this happen? Because Woodrow Wilson saw the balance between the legislature and the executive as too much of an obstacle to his utopian dreams. Woodrow Wilson wrote, "The president is at liberty, both in law and conscience, to be as big a man as he can. His capacity will set the limit. The president has the nation behind him. Congress has not." So the idea was you need an administrative government that was put into place at the top level by the president, and that would essentially run the country. And so the legislature is no longer a check against the executive as much as it once was, and the locus of rulemaking power no longer lies in the legislature. Instead, it lies in the presidency of the United States. A third way that the Democrats have sought to undermine American institutions is the attempt to redo the Senate. So it used to be that when Democrats held a lot of Senate seats, which they did for many, many decades in the 20th century, they weren't concerned about the Senate. Now it turns out that they are very concerned about the Senate because it turns out there are a lot of red states and not as many blue states, or at least a lot of purple and red states and not as many pure blue states. And so now you've seen people like Jamel Bouie at the New York Times overtly say that the Senate itself is bad because it's undemocratic. it's weird to suggest that pure majoritarianism is a solution to the problems of the United States, when in the past, pure majoritarianism has been used as an actual weapon against minorities. But nonetheless, Democrats, believing they have a majority, are now talking about fundamentally reshaping the Senate of the United States. They've talked about adding states willy-nilly to the Senate. Right? They want to add Puerto Rico. They want to add Washington, D.C. The goal of adding Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., of course, is to essentially add a bunch of Democratic senators and thus establish for themselves a permanent majority in the Senate of the United States. They want to combine that with killing the filibuster. The filibuster has been in practice in the United States since 1837. It was originally created almost by accident by Aaron Burr in 1805 when he suggested there was redundancy in some of the rules of the Senate of the United States. It was first used in 1837, but it has long been a protection for the minority in the Senate to prevent the majority in the Senate from simply running roughshod over the minority in the Senate. Democrats are quite fond of using it when they're not calling it a Jim Crow tool.
If all this takes eliminating the filibuster, another Jim Crow relic, in order to secure the God-given rights of every American, then that's what we should do.
Meanwhile, Barack Obama, when he was in the Senate, repeatedly used the filibuster. And just this year, Democrats have used the filibuster to kill Tim Scott's police reform and kill COVID relief. So in other words, they're in favor of the filibuster until they don't want the filibuster to be there, in which case they nuke the filibuster the way that Harry reads it. This brings us to the fourth attempt to undermine American institutions. Democrats have been talking for years now about packing the Supreme Court. They're angry that the Supreme Court is an obstacle to their great utopian dreams. Now, the way that the Democrats see the court itself is as a super legislature giving them everything they want. Remember, because Democrats very often disagree with the core philosophy of the Declaration of Independence, they disagree with all the institutional checks and balances. Instead, they would like to morph every institution of American government into a tool of leftist policymaking, which is why they appoint justices like Sonia Sotomayor, who vows that she's going to look into her heart for values. She's not going to look to the text of the Constitution. She's going to look into her heart for values. This is the way that Democrats tend to think about the Constitution of the United States. This is why Barack Obama said he wanted Sotomayor. She was a wise Latina who would be able to look to her own experiences. That's not the way any judge has ever interpreted law, but that's how leftists would love judges to interpret law. Well, packing the court is not unconstitutional. In fact, none of the things that we're talking about are unconstitutional. They're just violations of the institutional norms that break apart the entire system with real consequences, as I'll explain in a moment. There have been 9 justices on the Supreme Court since 1869. FDR tried to pack the Supreme Court. Because he tried to pack the Supreme Court shifted a lot of its constitutional jurisprudence in his favor, which is a really bad move. It made them a non-independent body. But in any case, Democrats have been talking about packing the court for at least several years now. And now, as Republicans nominate another Supreme Court justice, they would like to pack the court even further, thus to establish a sort of faux majority on the court that will give them everything they could possibly want. Finally, Democrats have been talking about getting rid of the Electoral College. They were fine with the Electoral College until it turns out that there's a discrepancy between the popular vote and the Electoral College that cuts in favor of Republicans in the past few elections. Obviously, in 2000, George W. Bush lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. Donald Trump in 2016 lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. They're deeply fearful that Donald Trump will do the same thing this time. That would require a constitutional amendment that is highly unlikely. The reason the Electoral College was put in place in the first place was specifically to stop majoritarian tyranny. The idea, and this was a compromise deal made by the states at the Constitutional Convention, would be, number one, to create an electoral college that would be a group of people who would be separate from the people. Right? They didn't want direct popular election. It would be a group of people separate from the people who would actually decide who the president was. That's sort of fallen by the wayside. And it would also put a little bit more weight on states that were historically sort of out of the way. And this is one way that you keep a union together. Because after all, if only the big states rule, why would small states want to be a part of that coalition? When you sum up all of this, what you end up with in undermining American institutions is an attempt to undermine the philosophy of the United States, which is a philosophy of individual rights protected by government. And the predictable result of all this stuff is not going to be bringing the country together. It's going to be destroying the country. Because let's say that you are the state of Texas, and let's say the Democrats succeed in getting rid of the Electoral College. They succeed in getting rid of the filibuster. They succeed in reconstituting the Senate. They succeed in packing the court. And then New York and California, with their heavy populations, decide to push forward a blatantly unconstitutional act, let's say a gun seizure. And let's say that they then elevate that to the Supreme Court that they have already packed. Do you believe that states that find themselves in the minority with their constitutional rights under attack are just going to sit by and do nothing? When you undermine the institutions of the United States, it turns out not only are you undermining American philosophy, very often you are undermining the very basis of a country itself. Because the agreement embodied in the Constitution, once you break that, there is no more agreement. In the end, the Democrats' attacks on institutions, it's really an attack on what the institutions were meant to protect. the founding philosophy. If our constitutional structure goes, so too does the freedom the Constitution was originally created to enshrine. Facts don't care about your feelings, and it's a fact that The Ben Shapiro Show is the largest conservative podcast in the nation. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to stay up to date on all of our content.